Kethral had been a soldier for 30 cycles. He had seen things that would break most beings. He had watched friends die on frozen moons and burning deserts. He had fought enemies that towered over him and enemies that came in swarms of thousands. His body carried the scars of a dozen campaigns, and his mind carried the weight of memories he wished he could forget. But in all his years of service to the Galactic Coalition, he had never felt true fear, not until that morning. The briefing room was full of officers from 6 different species. Kethral sat near the back, his scales flat against his body in the cool air. Commander Vorath stood at the front, his 4 eyes moving nervously across the assembled soldiers. Vorath was old and experienced. He had led armies across star systems. Kethral had never seen him look worried before. The Draxian invasion force has taken the outer settlements. Vorath began. His voice was steady, but something in it made Kethral pay closer attention. They number approximately 40,000 warriors. Our forces here total just under 8,000. Reinforcements are still 3 weeks away. A murmur went through the room. The math was not good. The Draxians were brutal fighters, with natural armor that could stop most weapons. 8,000 against 40,000 was not a battle, it was a slaughter waiting to happen. However, Vorath continued, and the room went silent. We have received unexpected assistance. A human ship responded to our distress signal. They are sending a combat unit to support our defense. The reaction was immediate. Officers who had been slouching sat up straight. Those who had been whispering went quiet. Kethral noticed that several of the older soldiers had gone pale. One of them, a Morathi captain with decades of experience, actually stood up and left the room without a word. How many? Someone asked. 12. Kethral almost laughed. 12 soldiers against 40,000 Draxians? This had to be a joke. But when he looked at Vorath's face, he saw no humor there. He saw something that looked almost like hope mixed with deep unease. I know what you are thinking, Vorath said. I thought the same thing when I received the message. But those of you who have studied the reports from the Outer Rim know what humans are capable of. Those of you who have not. He paused. You will learn. After the briefing, Kethral approached one of the older officers, a Valoran like himself named Dreth. Dreth had served in the Coalition for nearly 50 cycles. If anyone knew the truth about humans, it would be him. What is it about these humans? Kethral asked. Why does everyone act as if they are something special? They are small. They have no natural weapons. Their technology is not advanced. What makes 12 of them worth mentioning? Dreth looked at him with old, tired eyes. I served with humans once. Just once. On Kelrath 7. During the mining rebellion. And there were 5 of them. 5 humans against 300 rebels who had taken a facility hostage. Dreth's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Those 5 humans walked into that facility and walked out 4 hours later. Every single rebel was dead. The hostages were untouched. And the humans, 3 of them were wounded. One of them badly. But they were all still standing. Still making jokes. One of them was laughing. Kethral felt a chill run down his spine. That is impossible. I saw it with my own eyes. I watched the security footage afterward. I still have nightmares about what those humans did. Dreth shook his head slowly. They are not like us. Kethral, they are not like any species in the galaxy. They come from a death world. A planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them. And somehow, against all logic, they survived. They more than survived. They conquered it, and that did something to them. The human ship arrived that evening as the sun set behind the mountains. It was not impressive. In fact, it was one of the ugliest vessels Kethral had ever seen. It was battered and scarred, with patches of different colored metal where repairs had been made. The name painted on the side read, Dusty Roads in human script. Kethral had been assigned as the liaison to the human unit. He stood with a small, welcoming party as the ship's ramp lowered and the humans emerged. They were smaller than he expected. The tallest among them barely reached his shoulder. They had soft skin and no claws or armor plating. Their eyes were small and set close together on the front of their faces. Predator eyes, he realized. Forward-facing eyes, for tracking prey. Their leader was a female with short dark hair and a face that carried the marks of past battles. She wore worn combat armor that had clearly seen many fights. When she walked down the ramp, she moved with a confidence that seemed out of place for someone her size. "Sergeant Katie Monroe," she said, extending her hand toward the coalition officers. Her voice was calm and friendly, as if she were meeting them at a social gathering rather than a war zone. "This is my squad. We are here to help." Behind her came the others. A large male named Corporal Danny Vega, who smiled at everyone he saw. A thin, quiet male called Corporal Luke Navarro, who studied his surroundings with sharp, calculating eyes. And 9 others, each of them looking relaxed and almost cheerful despite the situation. 40,000 Draxians, one of the coalition officers said. "You understand what you are walking into?" Sergeant Monroe nodded. "We read the briefing on the way here, and you still came, 12 of you?" Monroe smiled. It was a strange smile. There was warmth in it, but also something else. Something harder. "We've faced worse odds." Kethril did not know if she was lying or telling the truth. Looking at her small, fragile body, he could not imagine what worse odds could possibly mean, but there was something in her eyes that made him believe her, something ancient and dangerous that did not match her friendly tone. "Where do you need us?" she asked. Vorath stepped forward. "We will discuss deployment in the morning. For now, you should rest. The battle will begin soon enough." "Rest?" Corporal Vega laughed softly. "Sure. We can do that." He looked around at the alien faces, watching them with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Don't worry about us. We've traveled a long way to be here. We're not going anywhere." As Kethril led the humans to their quarters, he could not shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Something that would change everything. These 12 small, soft creatures had crossed the stars to fight an impossible battle, and they acted as if it were nothing special. For the first time in his long career, Kethril wondered if the stories about humans were not exaggerations after all. The coalition commanders decided to place the humans in the reserve unit. It was the safest position, far from the front lines where the real fighting would happen. Kethril suspected they did this because they did not know what else to do with them. 12 soldiers could not hold a line or defend a position. They were too few to matter in a battle of this size. So they were put in the back, where they could stay out of the way. Kethril spent the next 2 days with the humans. His job was to serve as their guide and translator, to help them understand coalition protocols and procedures. But really, he spent most of his time watching them, studying them, trying to understand what made them so different from every other species he had encountered. The first thing he noticed was that they never stopped talking. They talked while they ate. They talked while they cleaned their weapons. They talked while they slept, mumbling words in their strange language, and most surprising of all, they talked about death. "Remember that time on Proxima?" Private Ben Cortez said one evening, shuffling pieces of painted paper that he called cards. "When that building came down on top of Second Squad?" "Oh man," Private Amy Huang replied, arranging her own cards carefully. "Martinez still has that piece of rebar in his leg. Doc said it would be more dangerous to remove it than to leave it in. He sets off metal detectors everywhere he goes." Cortez laughed. "But hey, he's still walking. Still fighting. That's what matters." They spoke about injury and death, the way other species spoke about the weather. It was casual, normal, as if these things were simply part of life, to be accepted and even joked about. Private Tyler Shaw told a story about his grandfather, who had served in something called the Marine Corps on Earth. The old man had been shot through the chest during a battle. The wound should have killed him, but he had wrapped it with cloth, picked up his weapon, and continued fighting for 6 more hours until the battle was over. Then he walked 12 miles to reach a medical station. "Doctors said he should have been dead 10 times over," Shaw said with obvious pride. "But Grandpa always said dying was for quitters." He lived another 40 years after that. Kethral listened to these stories with growing disbelief. In the coalition, soldiers who suffered such wounds were evacuated immediately. The idea of continuing to fight, of walking miles with a hole in your body, was not just impossible, it was insane. On the second evening, he found himself alone with Sergeant Monroe. She was sitting outside the barracks, sharpening a blade with slow, careful strokes. The blade was primitive compared to coalition plasma weapons. It was just metal, shaped and sharpened to cut. But she handled it with obvious affection, like it was an old friend. "Your species," Kethral said, gathering his courage to ask the question that had been bothering him. "You do not fear death?" Kethral. Monroe did not look up from her work. "We fear it plenty. Fear is natural. Fear keeps you alive. Then how do you do the things you do?" "The stories I have heard. They seem impossible for beings who feel fear." She stopped sharpening and looked at him. Her eyes were brown, warm in color but hard in expression. "Where we come from, fear wasn't enough to keep us safe. On Earth, everything wanted to kill us. The weather could freeze you solid or cook you alive. The water could drown you or poison you. The animals had claws and teeth and venom. Even the smallest creatures carried diseases that could wipe out entire cities. How did your species survive such a place? By being too stubborn to die." She smiled at his confusion. "Fear tells you to run. But sometimes running doesn't work. Sometimes the only way to survive is to stand your ground and fight. Even when every part of you is screaming to flee." We learned that lesson over thousands of generations. It's in our blood now. In our bones. Kethral thought about this. But surely there are limits. Surely there are situations where fighting is pointless. Monroe went back to sharpening her blade. "Maybe. But we're not very good at recognizing those situations. It's a flaw, I suppose. We keep fighting long after it makes sense to stop." She paused. "My grandmother used to say that humans are like water. You can't crush us. You can't break us. You can push us down, and we'll just find another way through. Around. Over. We adapt. We survive. We keep going." Across the camp, the other humans were preparing for bed. Corporal Vega was doing something called push-ups, lowering and raising his body, using only his arms. Private Megan Torres was writing in a small book, recording thoughts and memories. Corporal Navarro sat perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing slowly in what Monroe called meditation. "They're good soldiers," Monroe said, following his gaze. "The best I've ever served with. Every one of them has stared death in the face and told it to wait its turn. Not because they're brave, because they're too angry to die. Angry? At the universe, at fate, at anything that tries to tell them what they can and cannot do." She stood up and slid the knife into its sheath. "That's what the galaxy doesn't understand about us. Kethral, we're not special because we're strong, or smart, or advanced. We're special because we refuse to accept defeat. Even when we're beaten. Even when we're broken. Some part of us always says no. Always pushes back. Always gets up for one more round." She walked toward the barracks, then stopped and turned back. "The Draxians think they're going to win this battle because they have numbers and armor and weapons. And by any reasonable measure, they're right. But humans aren't reasonable. We don't do math when we fight. We do something older, something deeper." Her eyes glittered in the starlight. "We'll see what happens when they meet that part of us." That night, Kethral lay awake in his quarters, thinking about what she had said. He had fought many enemies in his career. He had seen courage and cowardice in equal measure. He thought he understood what made soldiers strong. But as he listened to the distant sounds of the humans laughing and talking in their barracks, he realized he did not understand them at all. They were facing an impossible battle, with almost certain death waiting for them. And they were laughing. Perhaps, he thought, that was the most frightening thing of all. Not their strength or their skill, but their absolute refusal to be afraid of what was coming, or rather, their ability to feel the fear and ignore it completely. The Draxians had no idea what they were about to face. Neither, if he was honest, did Kethril. The Draxian assault came at dawn on the third day. Kethril was in the command center when the first reports arrived, and within minutes it became clear that this would be worse than anyone had predicted. The Draxians did not attack in one place, they attacked everywhere at once. Thousands of warriors poured over the eastern hills, their dark shapes covering the ground like a living carpet. Their war cries filled the air, a horrible clicking sound that made Kethril's bones ache. Behind them came their heavy weapons, great machines that spat fire and plasma in continuous streams. The coalition's eastern flank held for 2 hours. Then it began to break. Kethril watched the tactical display as position after position went dark. Blue markers representing coalition forces disappeared one by one, swallowed by the endless red tide of Draxian warriors. The reports that came in told of brutal fighting, of soldiers being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, of defensive lines crumbling under the weight of the assault. "Eastern Command Post is gone," an officer announced, his voice shaking. "Colonel Methraz is confirmed dead. The 14th and 22nd Battalions are in full retreat." Commander Vorath stood at the center of the room, his 4 eyes moving rapidly across the displays. His face showed no expression, but Kethril could see the truth in his posture. They were losing. They were losing badly. "Signal all units," Vorath finally said. "Begin evacuation protocols. We will fall back to the secondary positions in the mountains." It was the right decision. The logical decision. There was no shame in retreating when victory was impossible. Better to save what forces they could and fight another day. Then a voice crackled over the communication system. A human voice. "Coalition Command, this is Sergeant Monroe. We are monitoring the situation. Requesting permission to move to the eastern sector." Vorath looked confused. "Sergeant, the eastern sector has fallen. There is nothing there but Draxians. Fall back with the rest of the reserve forces." A pause. Then, "Negative on that, Commander. We can see the tactical display. There are still coalition soldiers trapped in that sector. We're going to get them out. That is suicide. I am ordering you to retreat." Another pause. Longer this time. When Monroe spoke again, her voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. "With respect, sir, we don't do retreat. Not while there are people to save." Monroe, out. The communication channel went dead. Kethril stared at the display. The 12 blue markers representing the human squad were moving east, directly toward the heart of the Draxian advance, toward 40,000 enemy warriors. "They're insane," someone whispered. Vorath said nothing. He just watched the markers move. Kethril made a decision. He grabbed his weapon and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Vorath demanded. "To observe," Kethril replied. "Someone should witness what happens. Someone should record it." Vorath stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Be careful." Kethril was not sure careful was possible where he was going. He caught up with the humans just as they reached the edge of the combat zone. The sounds of battle were deafening here. Plasma fire lit up the sky. Explosions shook the ground. And through it all, the clicking war cries of the Draxians created a constant, horrible background noise. The humans moved differently than any soldiers Kethril had seen before. They did not march in formation. They flowed across the terrain like water, each soldier covering the others, using every rock and tree and depression for cover. Their communication was minimal. Hand signals. Brief words, they seemed to know what each other was thinking without needing to speak. "Contact front," Corporal Vega said softly. And immediately the squad shifted, spreading out into a wider formation. Kethril saw them then. A group of Draxians, perhaps 30 strong, moving through a destroyed building. They had not yet spotted the humans. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. The humans did not hesitate. They did not discuss tactics or plan their approach. They simply attacked. Private Cortez threw something small and round. It exploded among the Draxians with a flash of light and sound. Before the enemy could recover, the humans were among them. Rifles barked in short, precise bursts. Blades flashed. Bodies fell. In less than 2 minutes, 30 Draxians were dead. The humans had not lost a single soldier. "Move," Monroe ordered, and they pushed deeper into enemy territory. Kethril followed, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The humans fought with a ferocity he had never witnessed. But it was not wild or uncontrolled. It was precise, calculated. They knew exactly when to attack, and when to fall back, when to use their weapons, and when to use their hands. Private Torres took a plasma bolt to her shoulder. Kethril saw it hit, saw her stagger. He expected her to fall, to cry out, to need medical attention. Instead, she grunted, shifted her rifle to her other hand, and kept firing. Blood ran down her arm and dripped from her fingers, but she did not stop. They found the trapped coalition soldiers 20 minutes later. A small group, maybe 50, pinned down in a collapsed structure with Draxians closing in from all sides. The aliens looked up in disbelief as the humans appeared. "On your feet!" Monroe shouted. "We're getting you out of here." "There are too many of them," a coalition officer protested. "We cannot break through." Monroe smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Watch us." The humans formed a protective circle around the coalition soldiers and began to move. Every time Draxians appeared, they died. The humans were everywhere at once, shooting, fighting, dragging wounded soldiers to safety. Corporal Vega carried 2 injured aliens at once, one under each arm. While still firing his weapon, they fought for 6 hours. 6 hours of constant battle, constant movement, constant death. By the time they reached coalition lines, the humans had killed over 300 Draxians and saved 47 coalition soldiers. Kethril stood at the edge of the safe zone, watching the humans help the wounded toward the medical tents. They were covered in blood and dirt. Their armor was scorched and dented. Private Torres had finally allowed a medic to look at her shoulder, though she complained loudly about the fuss. Sergeant Monroe walked over to him. She was limping slightly, and there was a cut above her eye that was still bleeding. "You followed us," she said. "It was not a question. I needed to see." "And what did you see?" Kethril thought for a long moment before answering. "I saw 12 soldiers do what should have been impossible. I saw them ignore wounds that would stop any other species. I saw them refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain." Monroe nodded slowly. "That's us. Too stupid to know when we've lost." She looked toward the eastern horizon, where the Draxian army was still advancing. "But we're not done yet, not by a long way." There was something in her voice that made Kethril believe her, and for the first time since the battle began, he felt something he had not expected: hope. The next day brought the worst fighting yet. The Draxians had learned from their losses. They were no longer attacking in small groups that could be picked apart. They were moving in massive formations, hundreds of warriors at a time, overwhelming positions through pure numbers. The coalition had been pushed back to their last line of defense. Behind them was the main base. Behind that was nothing but open ground and death. There was nowhere left to run. Kethril had not slept in over 30 hours, but he refused to leave the human side. Something had changed in him since watching them fight. He needed to see how this ended. He needed to understand. The call came just after noon. A coalition scout unit had been cut off behind enemy lines. 80 soldiers trapped in a valley with Draxians closing in from all directions. Command had written them off as lost. There was no way to reach them in time. "We can reach them," Monroe said when she heard the report. "The valley is surrounded by enemy forces," Commander Vorath replied through the communication channel. "You would have to fight through nearly 2,000 Draxians just to reach the entrance, and then fight through even more to get out." "Understood. Sergeant, this is not a suggestion. This is an order. Stand down. Those soldiers are lost." Monroe looked at her squad. They looked back at her. Something passed between them, a silent communication that needed no words. "Sorry, Commander," she said. "Our radio seems to be malfunctioning. We're losing your signal." She clicked off the communicator and smiled at her team. "Well, you heard the man. 80 of our people need help. Let's go get them." Kethril followed. He knew it was probably suicide. He followed anyway. The journey to the valley was a nightmare. The humans moved fast, faster than Kethril had thought possible for beings with only 2 legs. They ran through enemy territory like ghosts, avoiding large groups when they could, destroying smaller ones when they could not. Private Chris Doyle was hit first. A plasma bolt caught him in the side as they crossed an open field. He went down hard, and Kethril was certain he was dead, but then Doyle rolled over, grabbed his weapon, and started crawling toward cover while firing at the enemy. Medic Beth Reyes reached him seconds later, already pulling out medical supplies. "How bad?" Monroe asked without stopping. "Bad enough," Reyes replied. "But he'll live. You know Doyle. He's too mean to die." They kept moving. By the time they reached the valley entrance, they had fought through nearly 300 Draxians. Private Tyler Shaw had taken a hit to his leg and was limping badly. Private Huang had lost 2 fingers on her left hand but insisted she could still shoot with her right. Corporal Navarro had a wound across his face that was bleeding freely, turning his features into a crimson mask, and still they pushed forward. The valley was worse than the reports had suggested. The coalition soldiers were pinned down in a collapsed building at the center, surrounded on all sides by Draxian warriors. Kethril estimated at least 500 enemy fighters, with more arriving every minute. "Well," Corporal Vega said, surveying the situation, "this is going to be fun." "Standard breakthrough?" Private Ryan Booker asked, pulling demolition charges from his pack. "Modified," Monroe replied. "We hit their center hard. Punch through to our people. Then we fight our way out together. Through 500 Draxians. At least." Booker grinned. It was not the grin of a sane person. "I love this job." The attack began with explosions. Booker and Private Nick Salazar placed their charges with expert precision, creating chaos in the Draxian lines. Before the dust had settled, the humans were moving, pouring into the gap they had created. What followed was unlike anything Kethril had ever seen. The humans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like something older, something primal. They screamed as they attacked, horrible sounds that seemed to come from deep in their chests, their faces twisted into expressions of pure rage. Corporal Navarro ran out of ammunition and did not slow down. He drew his knife and charged into a group of Draxians, cutting and stabbing with a speed that seemed impossible. 2 enemies fell before they even realized he was among them. Private Torres, still wounded from the previous day, grabbed a Draxian by its armored head and slammed it into a wall with enough force to crack the creature's skull. Sergeant Monroe moved through the battle like death itself. Her rifle never stopped firing. When she ran out of bullets, she used it as a club. When it broke, she picked up a Draxian weapon and kept fighting. They reached the trapped coalition soldiers in less than 10 minutes. The aliens stared at the humans with a mixture of terror and awe. "Get up," Monroe shouted. "We're leaving." "There are too many," a coalition officer stammered. "We cannot." "There is no cannot. There is only do. Now move." The breakout was brutal. The Draxians had recovered from their initial surprise and were closing in from all sides. The combined force of humans and coalition soldiers fought their way toward the valley entrance 1 bloody meter at a time. Private Doyle, despite his wounds, refused to be carried. He walked on his own feet, firing his weapon with one hand, while the other held pressure on his injured side. When a Draxian warrior got too close, he headbutted it with enough force to shatter its facial plates. Kethril fought alongside them. He was not sure when he had stopped being an observer and started being a participant. All he knew was that he could not stand by while these impossible creatures threw themselves into death for strangers they had never met. The Draxians began to fall back. Kethril could not believe it at first. He thought his eyes were deceiving him. But no. The enemy was retreating. Not because they were outmatched in numbers or firepower. They retreated because they were afraid. They had never faced anything like humans before. They had never encountered a species that simply would not stop. That kept coming, no matter how many wounds they took. No matter how impossible the odds. The humans had broken something in them. Some fundamental assumption about how battles were supposed to work. By the time they reached coalition lines, The humans had saved all 80 trapped soldiers. They had killed over 400 Draxians. And somehow, impossibly, none of them had died. Private Doyle collapsed the moment they crossed into safe territory. Medics rushed to him. Corporal Navarro sat down heavily on a rock and began calmly stitching his own face wound while refusing assistance. Private Torres finally allowed someone to look at her shoulder, though she spent the entire time complaining about the interruption. Kethrol stood among them, covered in blood that was not his own, and realized that everything he thought he knew about war was wrong. The humans had taught him the truth. Victory was not about numbers or weapons or strategy. Victory was about refusing to lose. The battle for the moon lasted 3 more days after that, but the outcome had already been decided in that valley, when 12 humans had done the impossible and made an army of 40,000 begin to doubt itself. Word spread quickly through the Draxian ranks. Whispered stories of the small, soft creatures who could not be killed, who kept fighting through wounds that should have been fatal, who screamed with rage and showed no fear. The Draxians were warriors. They understood strength and ferocity, but this was something different. This was something they had no word for in their language. The coalition forces, inspired by what they had witnessed, began to push back. Soldiers who had been ready to flee now stood their ground. Officers who had accepted defeat now planned counterattacks. Something had changed in the air itself, a shift from despair to determination. Kethrol fought in every major engagement over those 3 days. He stayed close to the humans whenever he could. Watching them, learning from them, he saw things that defied everything he thought he knew about living beings. He watched Private Shaw take a blade through his thigh and keep fighting for another hour before mentioning it to the medic. He watched Corporal Vega carry wounded soldiers to safety over and over again, refusing to rest even when his legs trembled from exhaustion. He watched Sergeant Monroe stand in front of a Draxian charge with nothing but her rifle, buying time for others to retreat, somehow surviving through a combination of skill and what could only be described as pure stubbornness. On the 4th day, the Draxian commander called for retreat. His forces had lost nearly 12,000 warriors. Their morale was shattered. They fled to their ships and disappeared into the darkness of space, leaving behind their dead and their shame. The coalition had won. When the final reports were compiled, the numbers told an impossible story. 12 humans had been directly responsible for over 900 Draxian deaths. They had saved nearly 200 coalition soldiers who would otherwise have been lost. They had participated in every major engagement of the battle, often appearing where the fighting was thickest, where hope was thinnest, and not one of them had died. 4 had been seriously wounded. Private Doyle had lost part of his liver to a plasma burn. Private Torres had needed 3 surgeries to repair her shoulder. Privates Shaw and Huang faced months of recovery, but they were all alive, all expected to make full recoveries. The coalition medical staff called it medically improbable. The humans just called it Tuesday. On the day the human ship was scheduled to depart, Kethrol found himself standing at the landing pad, watching the squad load their equipment onto the dusty roads. They moved slowly now, their wounds making every step careful. But they were still laughing, still joking with each other, still alive. Sergeant Monroe saw him standing there and walked over. She was using a cane now, her leg still healing from an injury she had not even mentioned during the battle. Her face carried new scars that would be permanent, but her eyes were the same as they had been on that first day. Warm in color, hard in expression. Predator's eyes. Kethrol, she said. Come to see us off? I have a question, he replied. One that has been bothering me since the day you arrived. Ask. He struggled to find the right words. Your species is not stronger than mine. Not faster. Your technology is not superior. Your numbers are small. By every measure that matters in war, you should not be able to do what you do. He paused. How? What is it about humans that makes you different? Monroe thought about the question for a long moment. Behind her, the other humans were settling into the ship, their voices carrying across the landing pad. Vega was telling a joke. Torres was arguing about something. Navarro sat quietly, His scarred face turned toward the sky. "You know what we have back on Earth?" Monroe finally said. "A saying. It goes, 'It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog.'" Kethral's translator struggled with the words. "I do not understand. It means that when everything else is equal, the one who wins is the one who wants it more, the one who refuses to quit, the one who keeps going when everyone else stops." She looked at her team with something like love in her eyes. "Humans aren't special because we're strong, Kethral. We're special because we're stubborn. Impossibly, stupidly, magnificently stubborn. But why? Why do you keep going when logic says to stop?" Monroe was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "We come from a planet that spent 200,000 years trying to kill us. Everything on Earth was a threat. The weather, the animals, disease, each other. We should have gone extinct 1,000 times over. But we didn't. Because some part of us refused to accept death as the end." She turned to face him fully. "That stubbornness is in our blood now. It's in every cell of our bodies. When we face something impossible, something in us just says no. Not maybe. Not let's try. Just no. We will not accept defeat. We will not lie down. We will keep fighting until we win, or until there's nothing left of us to fight." "The galaxy fears you," Kethral said quietly. "I understand now why." Monroe's expression changed. The hardness faded slightly, replaced by something more human, something almost sad. "We're not monsters, Kethral. We don't want to be feared. We just want to survive, to protect the people we care about." She gestured toward her team. "Every one of them would die for the others without hesitation. Not because they're ordered to. Because that's who we are. We fight for each other. We fight for people we've never met. We fight because fighting is all we know how to do." She extended her hand. Kethral took it carefully, feeling the soft warmth of human skin against his scales. "If you ever need us again," Monroe said, "send a message. We'll come." "Why?" "We are strangers to you. Different species from different worlds. Why would you come?" "Ever," Monroe smiled. This time it was a genuine smile, without hardness or edge. "Because you needed help. That's enough for us. It's always been enough." She turned and walked toward the ship. At the ramp, she paused and looked back. "Take care of yourself, Kethral. And remember what you saw here. Remember what humans are capable of when we have something to fight for." The dusty roads lifted off and rose into the sky, disappearing among the stars within moments. Kethral stood watching long after it was gone. Around him, coalition soldiers went about their duties, rebuilding what had been destroyed, honoring their dead. But many of them paused to look at the sky as well. Looking at the place where the humans had disappeared, the stories would spread. Kethral knew that with certainty. Soldiers would tell other soldiers. Officers would file reports. Within a cycle, every corner of the galaxy would hear about what 12 humans had done on this moon, and the fear would grow. The whispers would continue. The legends would build upon themselves until humans became something more than a species. They would become a warning, a promise, a threat. But Kethral would remember the truth. Humans were not gods or demons. They were simply beings who had learned to survive in the cruelest classroom the universe had ever created. They were survivors. And that made them the most dangerous thing in the galaxy.